Check that you have all of your patterns. Your front top, front facing, front sleeve facing, and front waistband. Back top facing, back sleeve facing, and back waistband. Front and back top skirt, pocket, and skirt panels. On the front top panel, locate the notches. Fold one notch to the other towards the side seam. Pin down to secure, and repeat this step for the next pleat. Baste along the waistline to secure the pleats in place. Repeat for the back top panels. Sew the front and back top together at the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowances and iron. Sew both front top panels together along the center front with a 1 cm seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowances and iron. Sew the front and back facings together at the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowances and iron. Sew the front facing panels along the center front with a 1 cm seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowances and iron. Align the facing to the top panels along the neckline. Sew along the neckline with a 1 cm seam allowance. A tip for sewing the corners. Measure and mark out the sewing line of 1 cm. This will enable a more accurate turning during sewing. After sewing, grab a pair of scissors and trim into the seam allowances to reduce the tension, along the back neckline and at the corners. Flip open the facing and push all the seam allowances down towards the facing and iron well. On the right side of the facing, understitch close to the seam line. Make sure that you're sewing onto the seam allowances below. Sew all the way from one end to the other. Baste the facing to the top along the waistline with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Sew the front waistband, the one with the interfacing, to the top along the waistline with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the back waistband, the one with the interfacing, to the top along the waistline with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew 2 panels of tie sash together along 2 long edges and 1 short edge with a 1 cm seam allowance. I'll be using a loop turner to turn the sash inside out. Feel free to use any other tool you may have. Iron well. Top stitch along the same 3 sides, 0.5 cm from the edge. Place the open end of the tie sash to match the front waistband, and then baste along the side seam with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Repeat this for the other side. To prepare the front top skirt, sew 2 rows of gathering stitch along the top. Locate the center point of the front top skirt and mark it. Also mark the center of the front waistband. Gently gather the gathering stitch to reduce the width of the top skirt so that it matches the width of the waistband. Sew the panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance, making sure that the center lines match up. Overlock. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitch along the top. With the center backs aligned, gently pull onto gathering stitch to reduce the width of the top skirt so that it matches the back waistband. Sew the panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock. Sew 2 panels of skirt along the center with a 1 cm seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowances and iron. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitch along the top of the skirt, then gather the fabric to match the width of the top skirt. Sew the panels together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock. Repeat the step for the back. On the top skirt panel, locate the notch for the pocket. Place the pocket just below the notch and sew it down with a 1 cm seam allowance. Repeat for the other side as well as the back panels. Only on the front pockets, open up the pocket and iron well. Understitch on the pocket panel, making sure to catch on the seam allowances below. Along the center back, sew the zip from the notch down with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Finish up the bottom of the zip with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Flip down the back facing. and sew along the center back with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Repeat on the other side. Turn it inside out and test your zip. If everything is working fine, then grab a pair of scissors and trim into the seam allowances at the corner to reduce the bulk. Flip open the back facing. Understitch on the back facing close to the seam. Make sure that you're sewing on the seam allowances below. Sew the back waistband along the center front, ensuring that the waistband is aligned to the center front and centralized to the waistband. Sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Flip open the waistband and understitch close to the seam. Flip the fabric in and just double check that the zip is still working fine. Next, sew the waistband down along the top. To do so, we're going to flip to the right side and sew in the ditch where the seam is. Do not sew on the zip, starting slightly away, sew in the ditch, making sure to catch the fabric below. Repeat for the other side. Sew the front waistband, the one with no interfacing, to the existing seam. If the edges are caught, just do a little bit of unpicking to release them. With the right side of the waistband to the wrong side of the top, you're going to sew all panels together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. You'll be sewing on the existing stitch. With front and back panels right sides together, sew along the side seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Sew front and back sleeve facing along the shoulder and side seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowances and iron well. Align the sleeve facing to the armhole and sew the panels together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance along the armhole. Grab a pair of scissors and trim into the seam allowances to reduce tension. Flip open the facing and understitch on the facing close to the seam. Make sure that you're also catching onto the seam allowances below. Fold up the skirt hem with a 1 cm seam allowance. Iron well. Then sew 1 cm from the edge of the cloth along the whole circumference of the skirt. You may want to sew the sleeve facing down by just doing a small bar tack along the shoulder seam. Add a hook and eye along the back neckline. And there you have it. Your dress is completed.